On Christmas Eve, when every home in Pine Ridge, Colorado glowed with warm lights and laughter, one house sat in darkness. A tiny wooden cottage on the edge of town, the only place where Christmas had quietly stopped existing. Inside, Eleanor Hayes, 80 years old, sat alone at a wobbly kitchen table with nothing but a stale dinner roll and a cup of instant coffee gone cold. She stared at the front door the way a child watches the sky for Santa, hoping, begging, that someone she loved would walk through it. But the ones she waited for never came. When the knock finally echoed through her home, Eleanor's fragile heart leaped, but what followed wasn't reunion. It was betrayal. Her own children stood on her porch with a stack of legal papers and a single message. The house wasn't hers anymore. She needed to leave. Tonight. Hours later, as snow swallowed the town and families gathered by the fire, Eleanor wandered alone into the wilderness, toward an abandoned hunting cabin where she believed she would spend her final night on earth. But somewhere between despair and death, a different knock would come. And this time, the one who stood outside her door would change everything. The wind swept down from the Rockies like a cold, uninvited guest, rattling the shutters of the little town of Pine Ridge. Christmas lights trembled under its breath, flickering across snowy rooftops and frosted evergreens as families hurried inside, their arms full of gifts and grocery bags and warm casseroles waiting for the oven. But on the farthest edge of Grizzly Creek Road, where the pavement gave way to cracked gravel and the street lamps became few and far between, stood a house that looked forgotten by time. A small cedarwood cottage, its paint chipped, its porch sagging, its windows dim, a home that once pulsed with life, but now carried the stillness of a long-held breath. Inside sat Eleanor Hayes, wrapped in a faded cardigan that had lost its warmth years ago. Her silver hair was pulled into a bun, wisps escaping around her temples like soft threads of winter fog. The cottage was quiet too, quiet, the kind of silence that makes a person feel smaller than they are. Christmas had always been Eleanor's season. She remembered the years when her late husband, Frank, would drag home a lopsided pine tree from the woods out back, laughing as needles scattered everywhere. She remembered her children, tiny, bright-eyed, loud, running through the house with candy canes, ornaments, and hope. There used to be the smell of gingerbread, the sound of music, the glow of togetherness. Tonight, there was none of that, just a woman who had given everything and ended up with almost nothing. On the kitchen table before her sat a dinner fit for someone the world had forgotten. A reheated dinner roll from yesterday, a half cup of watery coffee, and a single peppermint candy she'd saved from the church service the week before. The cottage creaked with every gust of wind, and Eleanor lifted her eyes to the front door as if expecting it to open, as if the universe might accidentally give her the miracle she no longer dared to pray for. Maybe this year, she whispered to herself. But even she didn't believe her own voice. The truth was sharper than the Colorado winter. Her 4 adult children had drifted so far from her life that she existed only in the background of their memories. Phone calls grew short, visits became rare, and slowly, painfully, Eleanor had learned how to celebrate holidays alone. She wrapped her cold fingers around the mug, whispering grace over a meal that couldn't fill her stomach, and tried to ignore the ache in her chest, the ache of being unseen, unwanted, unremembered. Outside, Pine Ridge rang with Christmas joy. Inside, Eleanor Hayes sat in the quiet, trying to remember what hope felt like. The clock on the wall ticked through the stillness, each second echoing like a reminder that Christmas Eve was slipping away. Eleanor tried to busy her trembling hands, folding a dish towel, straightening the placemat, adjusting the tiny ceramic angel Frank had bought her on their first Christmas together. But nothing eased the hollow ache in her chest. Then she heard it, the low hum of an engine crunching over fresh snow. Eleanor froze, breath trapped in her throat. Headlights spilled across her frosted window, sweeping slowly like a searching beacon. Two cars were pulling into her driveway. Her heart leaped so violently she pressed a hand to her chest. They came. After all these years, after all the half-promises, the forgotten holidays, the lonely nights, they finally came home. She rushed to the front door faster than her stiff knees usually allowed, a smile blooming across her face so wide it hurt. She didn't even grab her coat. The cold slammed into her the moment she opened the door, but she didn't care. She was a mother again. A mother waiting to embrace her children. But the smiles she imagined weren't there. Standing beneath the dim porch light were Michael and Rebecca, the oldest of her 4 children. Michael, with his immaculate gray overcoat and polished boots, Rebecca, clutching a designer purse, her expression tight as a knot. Neither looked joyful. Neither even looked warm. "Mom?" Michael said first. His voice held no affection, only stress, impatience. "We need to talk." Eleanor blinked, confused. "Oh, of course, sweetheart. Come in, come in. I don't have much prepared, but I can warm some coffee, and We're not here for coffee," Rebecca cut in sharply. She didn't step forward. She didn't remove her gloves. She didn't even look at the wreath on the door that Eleanor had hung with such trembling hope. "This isn't a social visit." The cold suddenly felt sharper. Eleanor swallowed hard. I don't understand." Michael exhaled, running a hand over his neatly combed hair before pulling a thick envelope from his coat. "This house isn't financially viable anymore," he said flatly. "And technically, after Dad passed, it became shared property between all 4 of us." Eleanor stared at the envelope. "What are you saying?" "We're selling it, Mom," Rebecca said. "No hesitation, no remorse. A developer made an offer. A good one. Papers are already signed by the others." Eleanor's breath hitched. Michael held out a pen. "You just need to sign your part. And you'll need to move out tomorrow morning." The wind howled behind them, but nothing was colder than the words hanging between mother and children. On Christmas Eve, the night meant for family, forgiveness, and warmth, Eleanor Hayes was being evicted from her own home. For a moment, Eleanor couldn't speak. Her lips parted, but no sound came, only faint clouds of breath drifting into the frozen night air. She stared at the pen in Michael's hand as if it were a weapon pointed at her heart. "Move out?" she whispered. "But this is my home. I've lived here for 47 years. Your father built the porch with his own hands." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, but her voice remained icy. "Mom, the property taxes are too high. The roof needs repairs. It's too much for you to maintain. Selling is the best option." "For who?" Eleanor asked softly. She already knew the answer. "For us," Michael admitted. "We all have our lives, our families, our responsibilities. We can't—" He hesitated, then finished with a brutality he didn't seem to recognize. "We can't keep carrying the burden." The words sliced through her. Burden. She pressed a hand to the doorframe to steady herself. "I never asked you for anything," she said, her voice shaking. "Not once. I worked double shifts so you could go to college. I walked to work in the snow so the car would be free for you. We know," Rebecca interrupted, "and we're grateful. But that was years ago. Things change." Eleanor's knees weakened. She felt the porch tilt under her feet. "Please don't do this," she begged. "Not tonight. Not on Christmas Eve." Michael's jaw tightened. "It's already decided. The buyer wants the house empty by tomorrow. We need your signature, Mom." He held out the pen again. But Eleanor couldn't lift her hand. It felt like it weighed 100 pounds, like every disappointment, every lonely holiday, every unanswered voicemail had gathered inside her bones. "I won't sign," she whispered. Rebecca exhaled sharply, as if tired of the entire conversation. "Then the lawyers will handle it. Either way, you can't stay here past tomorrow." The lights of their cars cast long, cold shadows across the snow. For a brief second, Eleanor searched their faces, hoping to find even a flicker of the children she once knew. The ones who used to curl up beside her during winter storms, who used to beg for one more Christmas story before bed. But those children were gone, replaced by adults hardened by ambition, pride, and the relentless pace of American life. Michael stepped back. "We'll come by in the morning, please. Just be ready." And without another word, without a hug, without even a Merry Christmas, they turned and walked to their cars. Engines roared to life. Tires crushed the snow. Two sets of taillights drifted into the darkness. And just like that, Eleanor Hayes stood alone on her porch, trembling not from the winter wind, but from the kind of cold that settles inside the soul. For a long time after the engines faded, Eleanor remained frozen on the porch, staring into the darkness where her children had disappeared. Snowflakes swirled through the beam of the porch light, landing gently on her slippers, melting into cold patches that seeped into her skin. Slowly, she stepped back inside and closed the door. The latch clicked, a small, fragile sound, yet it felt like the final seal of a chapter she never imagined would end this way. Inside the dim kitchen, everything looked exactly the same, and yet nothing did. Her children had stood in this very room just minutes before, not to embrace her, not to celebrate Christmas, but to take away the only earthly thing she had left. She pressed a hand against her chest. Her heart felt bruised, as if someone had squeezed it too tightly. Eleanor moved like a woman walking underwater, slow, heavy, numb. She reached the living room and sat on Frank's old recliner, the fabric worn thin from years of comfort. The silence around her grew thick. Outside, carolers somewhere down the street were singing Silent Night, their voices drifting faintly through the crisp air. All is calm. All is bright. Not here. Not tonight. Her gaze wandered to the family photos lining the shelf above the fireplace. Smiling faces frozen in time, birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings where wrapping paper covered the floor and joy filled the air. "How did we get here?" she whispered to the empty room. Her voice cracked as she added, "What did I do wrong?" Her only answer was the groan of the old house settling in the cold. Hours passed in a blur. At some point she stood, moving through the cottage with trembling hands, pulling down a small suitcase that still smelled faintly of the cedar closet. She placed inside 2 sweaters, her warmest pair of socks, Frank's Bible with the cracked leather cover, the photograph of her children when they were little, before life hardened them. Every item she packed felt like she was dismantling a piece of her heart. By the time she zipped the suitcase closed, the clock read 1:17 a.m. Outside, the snowfall had thickened, blanketing Pine Ridge in white silence. Eleanor stood in the center of her living room and turned slowly, taking in every corner, every shadow, every memory. Then she walked to the mantel, touched Frank's favorite photograph him, holding a freshly cut Christmas tree, and whispered, "I'm sorry, love. I tried." The cottage seemed to breathe around her, as if it too mourned her departure. Finally, she put on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, lifted the suitcase, and opened the front door. A blast of winter air struck her, the beginning of a journey she never asked for, and one that would lead her somewhere she could never expect. The morning light crept slowly over Pine Ridge, turning the snow-covered rooftops pink and gold. Christmas morning, a day when families filled their homes with cinnamon rolls, hot cocoa, and laughter. But Eleanor Hayes walked through that painted winter scene like a ghost drifting through someone else's holiday. Her boots sank into the snow with each step, leaving a fragile trail behind her. The small suitcase bumped against her leg, its wheels useless on the uneven, frozen ground. Every few steps she had to stop and catch her breath, her lungs burning in the thin Rocky Mountain air. The early church service had just ended. Families spilled out of St. Martin's Chapel, bundled in scarves and red mittens, children tugging on their parents' sleeves as they ran toward car doors. Someone played Christmas music from their truck Joy to the World, its cheerful melody cutting through the icy morning. Nobody noticed the elderly woman standing alone across the street, rubbing her hands for warmth. Nobody saw the hurt behind her eyes. Until someone did. "Mrs. Hayes?" The voice came from the right. Eleanor turned to see Carlos Mendoza, the owner of the small grocery store on Main Street. A kind man in his 60s, known for slipping free pastries into the bags of tired mothers and lonely seniors. He approached with a gentle frown. "You're out awfully early. Is everything all right?" Eleanor forced a smile. It trembled. "Oh, I'm just going to visit a friend up north." Carlos looked at the suitcase, at her thin coat, at the sadness she couldn't hide. He didn't push, but his eyes softened with understanding he couldn't yet explain. Without a word, he opened a paper bag he'd been carrying and held out a warm cinnamon roll, steam rising from its sugar glaze. "For the road," he said. The kindness struck her harder than the cold. She swallowed the sting behind her eyes and accepted it with both hands. "Thank you, Carlos. God bless you." "Y usted también, señora," he said softly. "If you need anything, you come find me." She nodded, though they both knew she wouldn't. As Carlos walked away to join his family, Eleanor took a small bite of the cinnamon roll. The sweetness melted on her tongue, and for a moment, just a moment, she felt like a person again, not a burden. But reality returned as quickly as it left. There was nowhere for her to go. So she kept walking, past the quiet shops, past the last mailbox at the edge of town, past the old wooden sign that read, "National Forest Boundary, Hunter's Trailhead." Beyond that sign lay silence. And farther in, somewhere among the trees, an abandoned hunting cabin where she planned to spend whatever came next. She tightened her scarf, clutched her suitcase, and stepped into the forest. The deeper Eleanor walked into the forest, the quieter the world became. Pine trees towered above her like dark cathedral pillars, their branches sagging under the weight of fresh snow. The wind whispered through them, scattering flurries that glittered like powdered glass in the pale winter sun. Every few yards she stopped to rest, gripping the handle of her suitcase with trembling hands. Her breath fogged the air in short, exhausted bursts. At last, after nearly an hour of slow trudging, she saw it. The hunting cabin. It crouched at the edge of a small clearing, half swallowed by time. The roof sagged in the middle. One shutter dangled by a rusted hinge. Snow piles pressed against the outer walls like silent, unwelcome guests. It wasn't shelter. Not really. But for someone with nowhere left to go, it was enough. Eleanor pushed open the warped wooden door. It creaked like it hadn't been touched in years. The inside smelled of cold earth and forgotten seasons, dust, pine needles, and old smoke from a fireplace that hadn't burned in a decade. The cabin's single window was cracked, letting in ribbons of icy wind. A broken chair sat in one corner. A collapsed cot lay in another. The floorboards groaned as she stepped inside. Still, it was better than the snowstorm forming outside. With stiff fingers, she brushed aside a pile of debris and lowered herself onto a spot of bare floor near the fireplace. She wrapped her coat tighter, hoping her body heat would cling to her. She pulled out Frank's old Bible, holding it like a lifeline. "I don't know what else to do, Lord," she whispered, her voice thin and brittle. "My own children don't want me. If I'm meant to stay here tonight, please, stay with me." The only answer was the wind whining through the cracks. As dusk bled into night, temperatures plunged. Her joints stiffened. Her eyelids grew heavy. Even the cinnamon roll Carlos gave her couldn't fight the cold settling into her bones. Darkness wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. At some point, she didn't know when, Eleanor lay down on the wooden floor, pulling her suitcase close as if it were a familiar hand to hold. Her breaths grew slower, her fingers numb, her thoughts blurry. "If this is my last night, please don't let me be alone," she murmured. The cabin fell quiet, completely still, until knock, a soft sound, almost a whisper. Then knock, knock, knock. Eleanor's eyes snapped open. Someone, or something, was standing on the other side of the abandoned cabin door. On Christmas night, in the middle of a forest where no one should be. For a moment, Eleanor wondered if she was imagining it. The soft cadence of knuckles against old wood. 3 steady taps echoing through the frozen air. No one should be here. Not this far into the forest. Not on Christmas night. She pushed herself upright, her bones protesting with sharp sparks of pain. Her breath quivered as she listened. Silence. Then, knock, knock, knock. Gentle, patient. Not the pounding of someone angry or lost. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. "Who's there?" she croaked, gripping the Bible with both hands. A pause. Then a voice. A man's voice, warm, soft and deep, carrying a tone she hadn't heard in years. Not commanding, not threatening, inviting. Eleanor. Her name drifted through the cracks of the door like a familiar melody. She froze. No one knew she was here. No one even knew she'd left her house. How do you know my name?" she whispered. Another small pause. Then, with the gentleness of falling snow, "I know every step you took today, and every tear you cried before that." Eleanor clutched the Bible tighter. This couldn't be real. "Please," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I'm not expecting visitors. Just leave me be." "I didn't come to trouble you," the voice replied. "I came because you asked not to be alone." A shiver, not from cold, crawled down her spine. She hadn't spoken those words aloud, not loudly enough for anyone to hear. She had whispered them into her sleeve, half-conscious, believing no one but God himself had caught them. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Who are you?" she breathed. A soft exhale, almost like a smile hidden behind breath. "A friend," he said. "One who understands what it is to have no place to rest his head." The words struck her like a bell, tolling in her soul. They were too familiar, too sacred. Her trembling hand rose to the doorknob. "Please," the voice said again, tender as a lullaby. "Open the door." Every instinct inside her warred between fear and an inexplicable peace, washing quietly through her chest. The air itself seemed warmer, as if the small cabin had begun to exhale. At last, with a breath that shook her whole frame, Eleanor turned the rusted handle. The door creaked open, and standing in the doorway was a man wrapped in a flannel coat dusted with snow, jeans worn from travel, boots cracked from long roads. His hair was chestnut brown, tousled by the wind. His beard trimmed but rugged. Eyes deep as a mountain lake at sunrise. Eyes that looked into her and through her at the same time. But it wasn't his clothes or his face that made her fall to her knees. It was his hands. When he lifted them in a gesture of peace, the glow of moonlight revealed something impossible: 2 circular scars in the center of each palm. Eleanor's lips trembled. "You?" The word dissolved into a sob. The man stepped forward, warmth radiating from him like a hearth on a winter night. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. "I've come a very long way to be with you tonight." And Eleanor knew, without logic, without doubt, without breath, she was standing face to face with Jesus. For a breathless moment, neither of them moved. Snow drifted softly behind him, glowing faintly in the silver light, as if the night itself bowed before his presence. The cold air outside seemed to hesitate, unwilling to enter the space where something holy stood. Then he stepped inside, and the cabin changed. The air warmed, not suddenly, but like the gradual blooming of a sunrise. The shadows retreated. The smell of old wood and dust loosened, replaced by something clean, gentle, like warm bread and pine needles after rain. He closed the door with a touch so soft it didn't make a sound. "Please," he said, offering his scarred hand. "Sit with me." Eleanor's legs were shaking too hard to stand, so he knelt instead, lowering himself until he was eye-level with her, as though the King of Heaven refused to look down on someone already so broken. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks. "I don't understand," she whispered. Why would you come here? To me? I'm nobody. My own children don't want me." Jesus held her gaze, and in his eyes she saw a depth she had never seen in any human face, a depth that knew sorrow intimately. "I know what it is to be rejected," he said gently. "My first night in this world, there was no room for me either." He spoke not with drama, not with pity, but with understanding so complete it broke open something inside her. Eleanor covered her face with trembling hands. "They called me a burden," she sobbed. "They threw me out of my own home on Christmas Eve." Jesus lifted one of her hands from her face and held it between his palms. "You gave your life for them. Every sacrifice, every tear, every sleepless night, I saw it all. I was with you in every moment." His touch radiated warmth through her chilled bones, as if life was gently returning to places inside her she had allowed to die. "Then why?" she whispered through tears. "Why did you let this happen to me?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he brushed a strand of silver hair from her forehead, his touch tender as a memory. "Some doors must close," he said softly, "so you can discover the one door that never will." She inhaled sharply. "And tonight," he continued, "you asked not to be alone. So I came." Her heart trembled. She had spoken those words in near silence, in near death, yet he had heard them. Jesus glanced around the cabin, the broken furniture, the cracked window, the cold floor. "You don't belong in the darkness, Eleanor. You never have." Then he looked back at her, his voice steady, gentle, unmistakably divine. "Let me sit with you in it and carry you out." And for the first time in years, she felt the faint flicker of something she thought she had lost forever: hope. Jesus glanced toward Eleanor's small suitcase, then back at her pale, trembling hands. "You haven't eaten," he murmured, not as a question, but as a truth spoken aloud. Before she could answer, he reached into the worn canvas satchel slung across his shoulder. She hadn't noticed it earlier. It looked ordinary, weathered, simple. Yet, when he opened it, a warm fragrance drifted into the cabin, soft and comforting, like something from a childhood memory. He pulled out a small cloth bundle, unwrapped it, and revealed 2 rolls of freshly baked bread, steam rising from them despite the freezing air. Eleanor gasped. "Where did you? How?" He smiled, a smile filled with the quiet mystery of someone who owes no explanation to the laws of nature. "Come," he said, breaking one roll in half. The crust cracked softly, releasing more warmth into the room. "Eat." He offered her a piece. Her fingers trembled as she took it. The bread was so warm it nearly burned her fingertips. When she bit into it, the softness melted across her tongue, and something inside her, something long buried, softened with it. It wasn't just food. It was comfort. It was life. Jesus ate quietly beside her, the 2 of them sitting cross-legged on the wooden floor like old friends, sharing a simple meal after a long journey. For several minutes, neither spoke. But Eleanor felt something impossible happening inside her. The ache in her chest was loosening. The heaviness in her spirit seemed to lift, grain by grain, like sand slipping from clenched fists. Finally, she whispered, "Why would you care about me? There are millions of people who need you. I'm just an old woman in a broken cabin." Jesus set down his piece of bread. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I left the 99 for the one. Tonight, you are the one." Her eyes filled again. She looked down at his hands, at the scars glowing faintly in the low light. "I still don't understand," she whispered. "Why did you let them hurt you? You were God. You could have stopped them." His voice lowered, deep as a mountain river. "Love doesn't run from pain. Love chooses to bear it, so others don't have to bear it alone." He lifted her hand, placing it gently against the scar in his palm. Warmth radiated through her skin, spreading all the way to her heartbeat. "I carried my cross," he said, "so that one day, when your heart broke, I could sit here and hold the pieces." Her breath shuddered. "And your suffering," he added, "is not meaningless. Every tear you cried for your children was a prayer, every sacrifice a seed. You may not see the harvest yet, but I have never lost a single seed of love sown in my name." Tears streamed down her cheeks, not of despair, but of healing. Because for the first time in her long, aching life, Eleanor Hayes understood. She wasn't abandoned. She wasn't unseen. She was profoundly, eternally loved. When the last crumbs of bread had disappeared between them, silence settled again. But it was no longer the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of a heart being rewoven, thread by thread. Jesus reached once more into his satchel, withdrawing a small glass bottle filled with clear, shimmering water. It caught the candlelight in a way water shouldn't, almost alive, almost luminous. Eleanor stared. What is that?" He held it out to her. "Living water," he said softly, "for the weary of spirit." Her hands trembled as she took it. The glass felt warm, as though it held a heartbeat. She unscrewed the cap, lifted it to her lips, and took a careful sip. The moment the water touched her tongue, something inside her ignited. Not a fire, not heat, but a clarity, a brightness spreading from her chest outward. Her mind, fogged by sorrow for years, seemed to clear. Her body, stiff with age and cold, relaxed. Her heart, bruised and knotted with grief, eased as though invisible fingers had begun untangling it. She gasped softly. "It feels like breathing for the first time." Jesus smiled. "That is what truth does." Eleanor lowered the bottle, her eyes full of questions that had never found an answer. "Why must life hurt so much?" she whispered. "I tried so hard. I gave everything. And still, I ended up here, forgotten, unwanted." Her voice cracked. "My own children turned their backs on me." Jesus leaned closer, his expression tender but solemn, like someone who had tasted sorrow deeper than any human ever could. "Your suffering does not diminish you," he said. "It refines you. Not because pain is holy, but because love is. And every wound you carried was born from love." She shook her head. "I don't understand," he continued gently. "When you wept alone in your kitchen, I counted every tear. When your hands ached from years of sacrifice, I remembered every stitch. Nothing given in love is wasted, not in my kingdom." Her throat tightened. "Then why did you let them hurt me?" He held her gaze. "To reveal what cannot be taken from you. Your worth, your dignity, your place at my table." Her eyes overflowed again. Jesus reached out, placing his scarred hand over her heart. Warmth spread through her like dawn breaking across a frozen landscape. "There is a healing you still need," he said. "A freedom you have not yet embraced." "What freedom?" she whispered. He spoke the words with a softness that struck harder than any storm. "Forgiveness." The word hung between them like a stone and a seed, heavy, yet full of hidden life. Eleanor's breath caught. She wasn't ready. Her wounds weren't ready. Jesus knew. And still, he stayed beside her. The one who asks nothing, he will not help her give. The word lingered in the air like a fragile spark. Forgiveness. Eleanor's breath faltered. Her hands curled into fists without meaning to, her whole body stiffening as if bracing for another blow. "No," she whispered. "No, I can't. You saw what they did. They threw me out as if I were nothing." Jesus didn't look away. He simply waited, his presence steady as the mountains outside. Eleanor shook her head, her voice rising with the rawness of a wound torn open. "They called me a burden. They didn't even hug me. On Christmas Eve, they shoved papers in my hand like I was a stray they needed to get rid of." Her breath trembled. "I gave them everything, everything, and they repaid me with this?" A tear slipped down her cheek. But it wasn't a tear of sorrow alone. It held anger, betrayal, a lifetime of unspoken pain. Jesus reached toward her, his fingers not forcing, just offering. "I know," he said softly. "I was betrayed too, by those I loved, by those I taught, by those I healed." She looked at him, pain flickering in her eyes. "But you're God. You can handle heartbreak. I'm just an old woman." "Being God didn't make my wounds hurt less," he said gently. "It only made my love deeper." She swallowed hard. He moved closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Eleanor, forgiveness is not excusing what they did. It is not pretending you weren't wounded. It is opening your hands so the bitterness can fall out." He placed his scarred hand over hers. "Right now the pain owns you. It dictates your thoughts, your breath, even the beat of your heart. Let me free you from that." Her chin trembled. "I don't want to forgive them." "You don't have to want to," he replied. "You only have to be willing." She closed her eyes. Inside her chest, two forces collided. The mother who still loved her children, and the woman who had been shattered by them. Images flashed through her mind. Michael as a little boy, running to her after a bad dream. Rebecca clinging to her dress on the first day of school. Andrew crying when he thought she had forgotten to pick him up. Lisa learning to button her coat with Eleanor's patient hands guiding hers. Her heart broke all over again. But this time, Something else slipped through the cracks. Something gentler, a breath that felt like surrender. "What do I say?" she whispered. Jesus' eyes softened. "Say their names." "And release them into my hands." Eleanor's lips parted, trembling. "Michael." Her voice cracked. I forgive you." A warmth bloomed in her chest. "Rebecca, I forgive you." Tears flowed, but they were different now. Lighter, cleansing. "Andrew." "Lisa." She pressed a hand to her heart. "I forgive you. All of you." The cabin brightened. Not suddenly, but like dawn, slowly spilling across a frozen meadow. The weight crushing her chest loosened, then lifted, then dissolved entirely. Jesus' expression glowed with quiet joy. "You have opened the hardest door," he whispered. "And now, love can enter again." For a long moment, Eleanor remained still, her hands trembling, her breath unsteady, her heart beating in a rhythm she hadn't felt in decades. Forgiveness had left her weak, and somehow stronger than she had ever been. Jesus watched her with a tenderness that felt like warm light brushing across her soul. "You've done well," he whispered. As he spoke, something changed in the cabin. The dim glow of the single candle seemed to stretch, deepen, expand, until light began to bloom from the very air itself. Soft at first, like fireflies rising at dusk, then brighter, warmer, more radiant, filling every corner of the old wooden walls. The cracks in the floor softened in the glow. The cold evaporated. The shadows fled. Eleanor gasped softly, shielding her eyes, but the light didn't hurt. It felt like being seen fully for the first time in her life. What is happening?" she whispered. Jesus rose to his feet with fluid grace, the light bending gently around him, as though it knew him, as though it obeyed him. "This cabin was a place of despair," he said. "Tonight, it becomes a place of healing." He approached the wooden doorway, the same place where she had nearly collapsed hours earlier, and rested his palm against the old frame. Light pulsed outward from his hand in a gentle wave. When he removed it, the surface beneath his touch shimmered. Eleanor stepped closer, breath catching in her throat. There, burned into the grain of the wood yet glowing softly like warm embers, was the imprint of a hand, his hand, with the unmistakable circular scar at its center. The mark radiated gentle warmth, like a heartbeat made visible. She reached out, hesitating only a moment before letting her fingers brush it. Heat, a soft, living warmth surged through her arm, then her chest, dissolving the last remnants of fear that lingered in her bones. She pressed her palm against the mark fully, tears slipping down her cheeks. "It's warm," she whispered. "It will remain so," Jesus replied. "A reminder that you were never forgotten. Never abandoned." Her voice cracked. "Why me?" He stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder, not heavy, not light, but steady, grounding her to the moment. "Because you opened the door," he said simply. "So many hear me knock. Only a few answer." The light in the cabin intensified for a heartbeat, flowing around him like a living veil. Eleanor felt it wrap around her, comforting, embracing, filling. The ache in her knees faded. The heaviness in her back lifted. The loneliness inside her dissolved like frost under a rising sun. A peace deeper than anything she had ever known settled into her bones. Jesus looked at her with soft, eternal eyes. "Eleanor Hayes," he said, "you are not alone, not tonight, not ever again." And in that moment, she believed him fully, fiercely, completely, because the light shining in her heart was the same light shining from his scars. Morning broke slowly over Pine Hollow, brushing soft gold across frozen rooftops and the quiet roads that cut between snow-covered fields. Eleanor stepped outside her cabin for the first time since the miracle, her small frame wrapped in the same coat she'd worn the night before, yet feeling lighter, steadier, almost newly born. The world looked different, not brighter, clearer, as if her eyes had finally learned how to see grace in simple things. But the peace of dawn didn't last long. Somewhere in the distance, she heard voices, concerned, excited, overlapping, then more. A dozen at first, then dozens more. She clutched her coat and turned toward the path leading down the hill. A crowd was gathering. People from town neighbors, old acquaintances, the sheriff, the pastor from Grace Chapel, all bundled in coats and scarves, trudging through the snow toward her cabin with urgency in their steps. Pastor Jonathan was the first to reach her. "Eleanor," he called, his breath fogging. "Are you all right?" Folks said they saw a light, an enormous flash from this hill just before sunrise. A younger woman stepped forward. "I saw someone walking down from here," she murmured. "A man, tall, wearing a coat. But when I called out, he disappeared behind the trees." Another voice chimed in. "And the snow was glowing. I swear it." Eleanor's heart thudded. They had seen him, or at least the trace of him. "I'm fine," she said softly. "Better than fine." People exchanged puzzled glances. Then Pastor Jonathan's eyes shifted toward the cabin. "May we?" he asked gently. She nodded. The group moved as one, slow, cautious, reverent, as if approaching something sacred. When Pastor Jonathan opened the cabin door, he froze. Gasps erupted behind him. There, on the wooden doorframe, glowing with a golden warmth that should not have existed in the cold morning air, was the handprint. Jesus' mark bright enough to illuminate the entire small entryway. Someone fell to their knees. Someone else began to cry openly. A woman whispered, "My God, he was here." An older man crossed himself without thinking. Pastor Jonathan touched the glowing imprint with trembling fingers. "It's warm," he whispered, tears filling his eyes. "It's truly warm." News spread faster than winter wind. By noon, nearly 100 people had climbed the hill. By sunset, the sheriff had to redirect cars from clogging the rural road. Families brought candles, others brought flowers. Some came in silence, some in prayer, some in awe. But everyone felt the same truth, settled deep within their souls. Something divine had walked among them, and it had chosen to leave its mark. Through it all, Eleanor stayed quietly by the cabin door, watching faces soften, hearts open, burdens lift. Strangers hugged her. Neighbors apologized for ignoring her for years. The pastor thanked her for letting the miracle be seen. But Eleanor shook her head gently. "No," she said, voice cracking. "I didn't make this happen." Her eyes drifted to the glowing handprint. He did. By late afternoon, the road to the cabin looked like a quiet pilgrimage. Trail locals climbing steadily toward the glowing handprint, some carrying candles, others imply carrying questions they'd buried for years. Eleanor watched from her small porch, wrapped in a blanket a kind neighbor had draped around her shoulders. She felt no cold. Not anymore. Then, amid the murmuring crowd, a hush spread suddenly, like wind changing direction. A car door slammed. Another. Then, footsteps. Several sets. 4 figures emerged from the trees. Eleanor's breath hitched. Michael, Rebecca, Andrew, Lisa, her children. The ones who had driven her from her home the night before. They stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, unable to move, unable to speak. Their faces, once hardened by pride and impatience, were now pale with disbelief as they stared at the glowing mark pulsing softly on the cabin door. Rebecca covered her mouth with both hands. Andrew stumbled backward as if struck. Lisa began to shake, tears already spilling. But it was Michael the eldest, the one who had shoved the papers into her hands, who broke first. He walked toward the cabin in slow, uneven steps, his boots sinking into snow as though the earth itself resisted anyone approaching without humility. He stopped inches from the handprint, lifted his trembling fingers, touched it. The warmth shot through him like a revelation. He gasped, hand flying to his chest. "Mom," he whispered, turning to her. "Mom." He was here. The others rushed forward, Rebecca sobbing, Andrew whispering frantic prayers, Lisa clutching her chest as though trying to steady her heart. Then, in a sight no one present would ever forget, all 4 dropped to their knees, in the snow, before their mother. "Mom," Rebecca cried, hands clasped, "please, please forgive us." "We were blind," Andrew said, tears streaming. "We were selfish," Lisa added, voice breaking. "We treated you like you didn't matter," Michael choked. "But God himself came here, because you do matter." Eleanor pressed a shaking hand to her lips. The sight of her grown children, once cold, distant, hardened, now trembling in repentance at her feet, felt like a dream she was almost afraid to touch. She stepped toward them. Snow crunched softly under her boots. The crowd held its breath. Eleanor placed a hand on each bowed head. "My children," she whispered, voice shaking with love, "I forgave you last night before I even knew you'd return." They looked up, eyes wide with shock. "It was him," she said softly. "He gave me the strength." The 4 siblings collapsed into her arms. A tangle of apologies, sobs, and the kind of love that must be broken to finally heal. As they embraced, the handprint glowed brighter, casting warm light over all 5 of them. And the people standing around understood. They were not witnessing a miracle of light. They were witnessing a miracle of hearts changed. As winter slowly melted into spring, the glowing handprint on the cabin door never faded. Some days it shone brightly like a sunrise in wood. Other days it dimmed to a soft ember, but it never went cold, never disappeared. Like the memory of his presence, it remained constant. People traveled from nearby counties, then from across the state. Some arrived seeking healing, others seeking answers. Many simply seeking hope, and somehow, in that small cabin on a snowy hill, they found it. Eleanor Hayes, once abandoned on Christmas Eve, became the gentle heartbeat of Pine Hollow. She welcomed visitors with warm tea and warmer eyes. She prayed with strangers who left feeling like family. She stitched quilts for newborns, shawls for the elderly, and hope for everyone in between. Her children returned every week, sometimes every day. Each visit another stitch, repairing years of hurt. The bitterness that had once lived in their hearts melted the same way snow melts under sunlight, quietly, steadily, beautifully. And through it all, Eleanor lived with a peace the world could not explain. 6 years after the night Jesus walked into her cabin, she slipped away on an autumn afternoon, her hands resting on the Bible he had once lifted, her face turned toward a warm, unseen light. Her last whisper was simple, "I see him," and those who loved her knew she had simply gone home. Today, the cabin still stands, the handprint still glows, and the story of Eleanor Hayes still transforms hearts, because the one who touched her door still touches lives. He still knocks, he still enters, he still heals, especially those the world has forgotten. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that Jesus still walks among us, still knocks on doors we thought were closed forever, please like, comment, and subscribe to Heaven Walks With Us for more miraculous stories of faith, hope, and redemption. Share this video with someone who feels forgotten or alone. You never know. A simple story may be the light that leads them back to grace. Heaven walks with us, where miracles still walk beside us, where no one is ever truly alone.